The warning lights flashed red across the control panel as Lieutenant Jake Morrison fought to keep his ship steady. The engine screamed in protest as he pulled the controls hard to the left, trying to avoid the massive asteroid that had appeared from nowhere. His reconnaissance vessel, the Swift Arrow, shuddered violently as another piece of space debris slammed into the hull. Come on, Jake muttered through gritted teeth, his hands dancing across the emergency controls. The ship's computer was shouting warnings in that cold, mechanical voice that always made bad situations feel worse. Hull breach in Section 3, oxygen levels dropping, navigation systems failing. Jake had been on routine patrol along the outer rim of human space when the asteroid field had suddenly shifted. One moment he was cruising through empty space. The next he was dodging chunks of rock the size of buildings. His ship's sensors had failed to detect the field's movement, leaving him trapped in a deadly maze of spinning debris. The planet Zephyr loomed ahead, its purple atmosphere swirling with strange clouds. Jake had never been to this world before, but he knew it belonged to the Valyrian Empire. The reptilian aliens who ruled this sector of space were not exactly friends with humanity. There had been tensions for years over mining rights and territorial boundaries, though thankfully no open warfare. Another impact shook the ship, and Jake watched helplessly as his engine readings dropped to 0. The Swift Arrow was going down, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He strapped himself in tight and prepared for the worst kind of landing. The ship hit the atmosphere like a bullet, flames licking at the viewports as friction heated the hull to dangerous levels. Jake's stomach lurched as the vessel spun out of control, tumbling through the alien sky. The ground rushed up to meet him, a landscape of jagged rocks and twisted metal structures. The crash was brutal. Jake felt his body slam against the restraints as the ship plowed through what looked like ancient ruins. Metal screamed against stone, and then suddenly everything went quiet. Smoke filled the cabin, and Jake could taste blood in his mouth. He unbuckled himself with shaking hands and stumbled toward the emergency kit. His head was pounding, and he could feel something warm trickling down his forehead. The ship's hull had been torn open in several places, letting in the alien air. Jake pulled on his emergency breathing mask. Not knowing if Zephyr's atmosphere was safe for humans, the planet's air turned out to be breathable, though it tasted metallic and strange. Jake grabbed his rifle, some medical supplies, and a handful of energy bars before leaving the wreckage behind. He needed to find shelter and figure out how to contact the Terran Defense Force for rescue. The ruins around him were incredible. Massive stone pillars rose from the ground like fingers, covered in strange symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. This place was old, far older than any human settlement. The Valyrians had built their empire on the bones of something ancient and mysterious. Jake made his way carefully through the ruins, his boots crunching on broken stone. The two sons of Zephyr cast weird shadows that played tricks on his eyes. Every sound made him jump, expecting to see Valyrian soldiers appearing from behind the crumbling walls. He found what looked like an entrance to an underground chamber, half hidden behind a fallen pillar. The opening was just wide enough for a human to squeeze through, and Jake decided it would make a good temporary shelter. He clicked on his flashlight and descended into the darkness. The tunnel was longer than he had expected, sloping downward into the heart of the ruins. The walls were covered in the same shifting symbols, and Jake had the uncomfortable feeling that they were watching him. The air grew colder as he went deeper, and he began to hear something that made his blood run cold. Someone was crying. Jake moved forward cautiously, his rifle ready. The sound grew louder as he approached what looked like a large chamber. He peered around the corner and nearly dropped his weapon in shock. In the center of the room sat a young alien, chained to a metal chair. She was clearly Valyrian, with the characteristic scaled skin and elongated limbs, but she was smaller than any adult Jake had ever seen. A child, or at least a young teenager by alien standards. Her scales were a beautiful blue-green color, but they had lost their shine. Her large eyes were filled with tears, and she looked thin and weak. She wore what had once been fine clothing, but it was now torn and dirty. This was no ordinary prisoner. Jake stepped into the chamber, and the young Valyrian looked up at him with fear. She said something in her native language, backing away as far as her chains would allow. Jake raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "It's okay," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The alien girl stared at him with those huge eyes, clearly terrified. She had probably never seen a human before, and Jake realized he must look like some kind of monster to her. He slowly set down his rifle and approached her with careful steps. "My name is Jake," he said, pointing to himself. "Jake." The girl watched him warily, but seemed to understand that he was trying to communicate. She pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Lyra. Jake nodded and smiled. "Lyra," he repeated, and the girl's eyes widened slightly. She nodded back. Jake examined the chains that held her. They were made of some kind of energy field rather than metal, humming with power. He had never seen anything like them before, but they were obviously Valyrian technology. Someone had put a lot of effort into making sure this girl couldn't escape. As Jake studied the restraints, he began to piece together what had happened. This was no ordinary prisoner. The quality of her clothes, the sophisticated nature of her bonds, and the fact that she was being held in such a remote location all pointed to one conclusion. This was someone important, someone valuable enough to hide away from the rest of the world. The girl, Lyra, watched him work with growing hope in her eyes. She began to speak in her own language, her voice urgent and pleading. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the desperation in her voice. She had been here for a long time, and she wanted nothing more than to go home. Jake made a decision that would change everything. He was going to free this girl, no matter what it cost him. She was just a child, and no child deserved to be chained up in a dark hole. Human or alien, it didn't matter. This was simply the right thing to do. Jake stared at the energy chains for what felt like hours, trying to understand how they worked. The blue light pulsed in a steady rhythm, and he could feel the heat radiating from them. Lyra watched him with growing hope, occasionally pointing at different parts of the restraints and speaking in her native language. "I wish I could understand you," Jake muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead. The underground chamber was getting warmer, and he wondered if someone was monitoring the energy output from these chains. Lyra seemed to understand his frustration. She closed her eyes and placed her hand on her chest, then moved it toward Jake. When she opened her eyes again, they glowed with a soft golden light. Suddenly, her voice in his mind was clear and gentle. "Can you hear me now, human Jake?" Jake nearly jumped out of his skin. The voice was inside his head, speaking perfect English, with a musical quality that made him think of wind chimes. "How are you doing that?" "My people have the gift of mind touch," Lyra explained, her mental voice weak but determined. "It takes much energy, but I can share thoughts with you for a short time. You must listen carefully." Jake nodded, trying to stay calm despite the strangeness of telepathic communication. "Tell me how to get you out of here." "The chains are controlled by a device hidden in the wall behind you. It looks like a crystal set into the stone. You must press it in a specific pattern." Lyra's mental voice grew fainter as she continued. "But you must know something first. I am Princess Lyra, daughter of Queen Zara. The rebels who captured me will kill us both if they find you here." Jake felt his stomach drop. A princess. He had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he had imagined. "How long have you been here?" 3 months, Lyra replied, her mental voice filled with sadness. "General Crix and his followers took me during a peace ceremony. They want to use me to force my mother to give up the throne." Jake turned to look at the wall behind him and spotted the crystal she had mentioned. It was about the size of his fist, glowing with the same blue light as the chains. "What's the pattern?" 3 quick touches, then 1 long press, then 2 quick touches. Lyra's mental connection was fading fast. "Hurry, I cannot maintain this link much longer." Jake approached the crystal and followed her instructions. 3 quick taps, 1 long press, 2 quick taps. The crystal flashed bright white, and the energy chains around Lyra disappeared with a soft humming sound. The young princess slumped forward, nearly falling off the chair. Jake caught her before she hit the ground, surprised by how light she was. Her scales felt smooth and warm under his hands, and he could feel her trembling with exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered in accented English, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I thought I would die in this place." "Not on my watch," Jake said, helping her to her feet. "Can you walk?" Lyra nodded, though she had to lean heavily on his arm. "The rebels have patrols that come through here every few hours. We must leave before they return." Jake picked up his rifle and looked around the chamber. There were 2 exits. Besides the tunnel he had come from, both leading deeper into the underground complex. Which way? The left tunnel leads to the surface, but it is heavily guarded. The right tunnel is longer and more dangerous, but it connects to the old mining shafts that run under the mountains. Jake considered their options. He was one man with a rifle, and Lyra was weak from months of captivity, fighting their way through. Guards would be suicide. The mining shafts it is. They moved slowly through the right tunnel, Jake keeping his flashlight beam low to avoid detection. Lyra walked beside him, her breathing labored but determined. The tunnel walls were covered in more of the strange symbols, and Jake noticed they seemed to react to Lyra's presence, glowing brighter when she passed. "Your people built all this?" Jake asked quietly. "No," Lyra replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place is much older than the Valyrian Empire. We found it when we first came to this world, but we never learned who built it or why." They left. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Jake could feel a slight breeze carrying the scent of fresh air. They were getting closer to the surface, but they were also getting closer to potential danger. Every shadow could hide an enemy, every sound could be a patrol coming to check on the prisoner. They reached a junction where 3 tunnels met. Jake was about to ask Lyra which way to go when he heard voices echoing from the left passage. The words were in the Valyrian language, but the tone was unmistakably hostile. "The guards," Lyra whispered, pressing close to Jake. "They are coming for the evening check." Jake pulled her into the shadows of the right tunnel and raised his rifle. The voices grew louder, and he could see the glow of alien flashlights reflecting off the tunnel walls. 3 Valyrian soldiers appeared at the junction, their scales a darker green than Lyra's, their eyes glowing yellow in the darkness. The soldiers were heavily armed and moved with military precision. Jake knew he could probably take them in a fight, but the noise would bring more guards running. He needed a different approach. "Stay here," he whispered to Lyra, then crept forward silently. Jake had learned a lot about stealth during his military training, but he had never tested those skills against alien senses. He moved carefully, staying in the shadows and controlling his breathing. The first guard was examining the symbol-covered walls, his back turned to Jake. Jake struck quickly, using the butt of his rifle to knock the guard unconscious. The Valyrian dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering on the stone floor. The noise made the other 2 guards turn, but Jake was already moving. He tackled the second guard, wrestling for control of the alien's plasma rifle. The weapon was heavier than human guns, but Jake managed to tear it from the guard's grip and use it to stun him. The third guard was raising his own weapon when Lyra suddenly appeared behind him. "Sleep," she said, placing her hand on the guard's neck. The soldier's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the ground. Jake stared at her in amazement. "How did you do that?" "Valyrian touch healing can also bring sleep," Lyra explained, swaying slightly from the effort. "But it takes much energy, and I am already weak." Jake caught her as she stumbled, then quickly gathered the guards' weapons. "We need to move. When these 3 don't report in, more will come looking." They continued through the mining tunnels, following Lyra's directions toward the surface. The princess grew stronger as they walked, her natural healing abilities slowly restoring her energy. She began to tell Jake about her people and their culture, speaking in hushed tones as they navigated the underground maze. "My mother has worked for years to bring peace between our peoples," Lyra said. "She believes that Valyrians and humans can be allies, not enemies." "Not everyone agrees with her, I guess," Jake replied, thinking of the rebels who had captured her. "General Crix thinks humans are inferior, that we should conquer your worlds instead of negotiating with you. He has many followers who believe the same thing." They reached a natural cave system that connected to the ancient tunnels, and Jake could see stars through an opening far above. Fresh air flowed down from the surface, carrying the scent of alien vegetation. "We are almost free," Lyra said, her voice filled with hope for the first time since Jake had found her. The surface of Zephyria was unlike anything Jake had ever seen. 2 purple moons hung in the dark sky, casting strange shadows across a landscape of crystalline rocks and twisted metal trees. The air shimmered with energy, and Jake could feel it tingling against his skin like static electricity. Lyra breathed deeply, her scales brightening as she absorbed the alien atmosphere. "I had forgotten how beautiful my world is," she said, her voice stronger now that they were free of the underground. Prison. Jake checked his compass and frowned. The magnetic fields on this planet were playing havoc with his equipment. "Which way to the capital?" "North, toward the Great Spire," Lyra pointed to a massive tower visible in the distance, its peak lost in the clouds. "But it is very far." Many days of walking through dangerous territory. They began their journey across the alien landscape, moving carefully through the crystalline forest. The metal trees chimed softly in the wind, creating an eerie music that made Jake's skin crawl. Every shadow could hide danger, every sound could be a threat. "Tell me about your people," Jake said as they walked, trying to keep Lyra talking. He had learned in the military that conversation helped pass time and kept minds sharp during long marches. "Valyrians are not so different from humans," Lyra replied, ducking under a low-hanging branch of living metal. "We have families, we love our children, we hope for peace. But we also have those who choose war over understanding." They had been walking for several hours when Jake heard something that made him freeze. The sound of engines in the distance. Growing closer, he grabbed Lyra's arm and pulled her behind a cluster of crystal formations. "Patrol craft," Lyra whispered, her eyes wide with fear. They must have found the unconscious guards. Jake watched as 3 sleek aircraft swept overhead, their searchlights cutting through the darkness. The ships were beautiful in their own way, with smooth curves and glowing energy cores, but they represented death if they were spotted. "They will search in a pattern," Lyra said quietly. "We must move toward the mountains where the ships cannot follow easily." They changed course, heading for the rocky peaks that rose like jagged teeth against the star-filled sky. The terrain grew more difficult as they climbed, forcing them to use their hands as much as their feet. Jake's military training helped him navigate the treacherous path, but he worried about Lyra's strength. "I am not as weak as I look," she said, reading his expression. "Valyrian children are taught to climb before they can walk properly." She proved her point by scaling a nearly vertical rock face with the grace of a natural climber. Jake followed more slowly, his human muscles straining against the alien gravity. The weight felt wrong here, lighter than Earth but with a strange, pulling sensation that made balance difficult. They reached a plateau just as the first sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jake had never seen a more beautiful sunrise, but he was too tired to appreciate it fully. They had been walking all night, and his body was demanding rest. "We can rest here," Lyra said, settling down behind a large boulder. "The ships will not search this high during the day." Jake opened his pack and offered Lyra one of his emergency food bars. She took it gratefully, though she made a face at the taste. "Human food is very bland," she said politely. "Sorry, it's not exactly gourmet cuisine," Jake replied, unwrapping his own bar. "What do your people usually eat?" "We prefer foods with more energy, things that grow in the crystal forests or swim in the acid lakes." "Your food tastes like eating rock powder." Despite everything they had been through, Jake found himself laughing. "I've had worse meals in the military." They rested for a few hours, taking turns keeping watch. Jake studied Lyra as she slept, fascinated by how her scales changed color with her breathing. When she was calm, they showed beautiful patterns of blue and green, but when she was stressed or frightened, they darkened to almost black. When Lyra woke, she seemed different somehow. Stronger, more alert. "The sunlight gives us energy," she explained, stretching like a cat. "I feel much better now." They continued their journey, following game trails through the mountains. The path was dangerous, with loose rocks and sudden drops, but it kept them hidden from the search patrols. Jake began to relax slightly, thinking they might actually make it to safety. That was when the shadow beast attacked. Jake had never seen anything like it. The creature was the size of a large bear, but it moved like liquid darkness, flowing over the rocks with impossible speed. Its eyes glowed red, and its claws were longer than Jake's fingers. "Run!" Lyra screamed, but there was nowhere to go. The beast had appeared between them and the narrow trail, cutting off their escape route. Jake raised his rifle and fired, but the energy beam passed right through the creature as if it were made of smoke. The beast lunged at him, its claws raking across his chest and tearing through his uniform like paper. Jake rolled aside, pain exploding through his body. He could feel blood soaking into his shirt, but he ignored it and fired again. This time he aimed for the rocks above the creature, causing an avalanche that should have buried it. The shadow beast simply flowed through the falling stones and attacked again. Jake dove sideways, but he was too slow. The creature's claws caught him across the back, sending him tumbling toward the edge of the cliff. "Jake!" Lyra's voice was filled with terror. Jake managed to catch himself on a ledge, his legs dangling over a drop that seemed to go on forever. The shadow beast moved toward him, ready to finish what it had started. That was when Lyra did something incredible. She stepped between Jake and the creature, her scales glowing with brilliant light. The beast recoiled, hissing like an angry snake. "You cannot have him," she said, her voice carrying a power that made the air itself vibrate. "He's under my protection." The shadow beast circled her, looking for an opening, but Lyra's light seemed to burn it whenever it got too close. She was using some kind of Valyrian ability that Jake had never heard of, turning herself into a living shield. "How long can you keep that up?" Jake asked, pulling himself back onto solid ground. "Not long," Lyra replied through gritted teeth. "The light burns my energy quickly." Jake looked around desperately for another solution. His rifle was useless against this thing, and they were trapped on a narrow ledge with nowhere to run. That was when he noticed something interesting about the creature's behavior. "It's afraid of bright light," he said, understanding suddenly. "That's why it only attacks during the day in shadowed areas." Jake pulled out his emergency flare gun and loaded it with his brightest flare. The shadow beast was preparing to attack again when Jake fired the flare directly at its center mass. The creature screamed, a sound like tearing metal, and dissolved into wisps of darkness that blew away on the wind. Jake and Lyra stood there for a moment, breathing hard and trying to process what had just happened. "You saved my life," Lyra said, looking at Jake with something like awe. "Even when you were wounded and in danger yourself, you found a way to protect me." Jake felt the pain in his chest and back for the first time since the fight began. The shadow beast's claws had cut deep, and he was losing blood faster than he had realized. He sat down heavily on a rock, his vision starting to blur. "Jake," Lyra was beside him instantly, her hands glowing with soft golden light. "Let me help." "You." She placed her hands on his wounds, and Jake felt an incredible warmth flowing through his body. The pain began to fade, and he could feel the cuts closing under her touch. It was the most amazing thing he had ever experienced. "Thank you," he whispered, looking into her large, compassionate eyes. "I think we make a good team." Lyra smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her. "Yes, we do. My people have a saying, when someone saves your life, they become your shield brother." "You are my shield brother now, Jake Morrison." Jake felt something change inside him at those words. This was no longer just about helping a prisoner escape. This was about family, about bonds that transcended species and politics. He would protect this brave young alien with his life, and he knew she would do the same for him. The sound of distant explosions woke Jake from his sleep. He sat up quickly, his hand reaching for his rifle as orange light flickered across the night sky. Lyra was already awake, her scales shifting to a deep purple color that Jake had learned. "Meant she was afraid. What is that?" Jake asked, though he already suspected the answer. "The capital is under attack," Lyra whispered, her voice filled with horror. "General Crix has made his move against my mother. They had been traveling for 5 days since the shadow beast attack. Moving carefully through the mountain passes toward the Great Spire, Jake's wounds had healed, completely thanks to Lyra's healing abilities, but the journey had been exhausting. Now, with the capital city visible in the valley below, they could see the full scope of the rebel assault. The city was burning. Massive structures that had stood for centuries were collapsing under the bombardment of rebel weapons. Flying vehicles dotted between the buildings like angry insects, their energy beams cutting through the darkness. The palace complex at the center of the city was surrounded by explosions, its protective shields flickering weakly. "We have to get down there," Lyra said, starting to stand. "My mother needs me." Jake caught her arm gently. "Hold on. Run into the middle of a battle is suicide. We need a plan." Lyra's eyes flashed with anger. "My people are dying while we sit here and talk. And they'll keep dying if we get ourselves killed trying to help," Jake replied firmly. "I've seen urban warfare before. The key is to stay smart, stay alive, and find the right moment to act." Jake studied the battle through his rifle's scope. The rebel forces were well organized, attacking in coordinated waves while loyalist defenders tried to hold key positions. The palace was still standing, which meant Queen Zara was probably alive, but the defensive perimeter was shrinking with each passing hour. "There," Jake pointed to a section of the city where the fighting seemed less intense. "We can get into the city through the old market district. The rebels are focused on military targets, not civilian areas. They had made their way down from the mountains, using the cover of darkness to approach the outskirts of the city. The smell of smoke and burnt metal filled the air, and Jake could hear the screams of the wounded carried on the wind. War was ugly no matter what planet you were on. The market district was in chaos. Valyrian civilians ran through the streets carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. Many of them stopped to stare at Jake, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. A human in their city during a civil war was the last thing anyone expected to see. "Stay close to me," Lyra said, her voice carrying the authority of her royal blood. "They will not harm you if they know you are under my protection." They moved through the crowded streets, dodging falling debris and avoiding the scattered groups of rebel soldiers who were looting abandoned buildings. Jake kept his rifle ready but tried to avoid using it unless absolutely necessary. Every shot would attract attention they couldn't afford. A massive explosion rocked the ground beneath their feet, and Jake saw one of the palace's defensive towers collapse in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. The rebel forces were getting closer to their target, and time was running out. This way, Lyra led him through a narrow alley between two damaged buildings. "There is a service tunnel that leads directly to the palace. My mother showed it to me when I was young." The tunnel entrance was hidden behind a pile of rubble, but Lyra's memory proved accurate. They squeezed through the narrow opening and found themselves in a maintenance corridor that ran beneath the city streets. The walls were lined with glowing crystals that provided just enough light to navigate. "These tunnels are thousands of years old," Lyra explained as they hurried through the underground passage. "The original builders used them to move supplies and people during emergencies." Jake was amazed by the engineering. The tunnels were perfectly straight and showed no signs of wear despite their obvious age. Whoever had built this place had been incredibly advanced, perhaps even more so than the current Valyrian civilization. They reached a junction where several tunnels met, and Jake heard voices echoing from one of the passages. The words were in the Valyrian language, but the tone was harsh and military. Rebel soldiers had found the tunnel system. "They are searching for alternate routes into the palace," Lyra whispered. "We must reach the royal chambers before they do." Jake counted at least 6 different voices, all moving in their direction. His rifle had enough power for maybe a dozen shots, and he had no idea how many more rebels might be in the tunnels. They needed to avoid a fight if possible. "Is there another way?" he asked. Lyra nodded and led him down a side passage that sloped upward. "This path is more dangerous, but it leads directly to the throne room." The tunnel grew narrower as they climbed, forcing them to move in single file. Jake could feel the weight of the city above them, and he tried not to think about what would happen if the ceiling collapsed. The sound of the battle grew louder, suggesting they were getting close to the surface. They emerged through a hidden panel in the wall of what looked like a storage room. Lyra pressed her hand against a crystal panel, and the wall slid shut behind them, once again appearing to be solid stone. "The throne room is just ahead," Lyra said, her voice tight with emotion. "But Jake, you must understand something. If my mother sees you as a threat, she will not hesitate to have you killed. Humans and Valyrians have not been friends for many years." Jake nodded grimly. He had risked everything to bring Lyra home, and now he was about to face the most powerful being in the Valyrian Empire. A single wrong word could mean death, but he had come too far to turn back now. They moved through the palace corridors, passing ancient tapestries and priceless artwork. The walls shook with each explosion, and Jake could see cracks appearing in the stone. The palace's defenses were failing, and it was only a matter of time before the rebels broke through. A group of Valyrian guards rounded the corner ahead, their weapons raised and ready. They saw Lyra and immediately dropped to one knee, but their eyes fixed on Jake with suspicion and hostility. "Princess Lyra," the lead guard said in accented English. "We thought you were dead. Who is this human, and why is he in the palace?" "He is my shield brother," Lyra replied with authority that brooked no argument. "He saved my life and brought me home. You will treat him with respect." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. The concept of a human shield brother was clearly difficult for them to accept, but they could not argue with their princess. "The queen is in the throne room," the guard captain said finally. "She is coordinating the defense, but the rebels are breaking through the outer walls." "Then we must hurry," Lyra said, moving past the guards toward the throne room. Jake followed, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. In a few minutes he would come face to face with Queen Zara, one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. The success of their entire mission depended on what happened in that encounter. The massive doors to the throne room stood ahead, carved with intricate symbols that seemed to move in the flickering light. Two guards stood at attention, their weapons gleaming with deadly energy. "Are you ready?" Lyra asked, looking up at Jake with trust and gratitude in her large eyes. Jake took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's go meet your mother." The throne room doors opened with a deep rumbling sound that echoed through the vast chamber beyond. Jake stepped inside and immediately felt small in the presence of such overwhelming majesty. The room was enormous, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows high above. Glowing crystals lined the walls, casting everything in an ethereal blue light that made the space feel both ancient and alive. At the far end of the room, on a throne carved from a single massive crystal, sat Queen Zara of the Valyrian Empire. She was magnificent and terrifying at the same time. Her scales shimmered like emeralds in the crystal light, and her eyes held the wisdom and power of someone who had ruled for centuries. She was larger than Lyra, more imposing, with an aura of command that made Jake understand why an entire empire bowed to her will around the throne. Dozens of Valyrian nobles and military officers stood in discussion, their voices urgent as they coordinated the defense of the capital. Maps and tactical displays floated in the air, showing the rebel advance in real time. The situation looked desperate. When Queen Zara saw Lyra enter the room, everything stopped. The conversations died away, the floating displays froze, and every eye in the chamber turned toward the entrance. For a moment, the only sound was the distant rumble of explosions from the ongoing battle. "Lyra?" Queen Zara's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried clearly across the silent room. The powerful monarch rose from her throne, her composure cracking for the first time in months. "Mother, I've returned." "He saved me," Lyra called out, her voice filled with joy and relief as she ran across the vast floor toward her mother's throne. Jake stayed near the entrance. Knowing this moment belonged to the royal family, he watched as mother and daughter embraced, their scales glowing brighter with shared emotion. Queen Zara held her daughter tightly, as if afraid she might disappear again if she let go. "My child," the queen said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We thought you were dead. Crick sent us pieces of your clothing covered in blood. We held funeral ceremonies. He wanted you to think I was gone, Lyra replied, pulling back to look into her mother's eyes. But Jake found me in the old ruins, where they were keeping me prisoner. He freed me and brought me home, even though it meant risking his own life. Queen Zara's gaze shifted to Jake, and he felt the full weight of her attention. Her eyes were like molten gold, ancient and powerful, studying him with an intensity that made him want to step backward. The other Valerians in the room moved closer, some reaching for their weapons. "A human," Queen Zara said, her voice neutral, but carrying an undertone of suspicion. "Here, in my throne room, during the darkest hour of our empire's history." Jake stepped forward and bowed respectfully, the way he had been taught to address superior officers in the military. "Your Majesty, I am Lieutenant Jake Morrison of the Terran Defense Force. I was stranded on your world by accident, and I found your daughter imprisoned by rebels. I could not leave her there. Could not or would not?" the Queen asked, moving down the steps from her throne to stand before him. She was nearly 2 feet taller than Jake, and her presence was overwhelming. "Would not," Jake replied honestly. "She was just a child being held prisoner. It didn't matter to me what species she was or what politics were involved. It was simply the right thing to do." One of the Valyrian nobles stepped forward, his scales dark with anger. "Your Majesty, this could be a trick. The humans might be working with Crix. How do we know this is not part of some larger deception?" Queen Zara raised her hand for silence, never taking her eyes off Jake. "Tell me, human, what do you know of our laws and customs?" "Very little," Jake admitted. "But your daughter taught me about the concept of shield brothers during our journey. She honored me with that title, though I'm not sure I deserve it." The room erupted in surprised murmurs. The concept of a human shield brother was clearly shocking to the assembled nobles. Some looked scandalized, others seemed merely confused. "You understand what this means?" Queen Zara asked, her voice carrying a note of warning. "To be named shield brother by a member of the royal family creates bonds that cannot be broken. You would be bound to protect our bloodline with your life, and we would be bound to protect you in return." "I already protected her with my life," Jake replied simply, "several times during our journey here. I would do it again without hesitation." Queen Zara studied him for a long moment, then turned to her daughter. "Tell me everything, child. Leave out no detail." Lyra recounted their entire journey, from Jake's discovery of her prison to their escape through the tunnels to their battle with the Shadow Beast. She spoke of Jake's courage, his willingness to sacrifice himself for her safety, and his determination to bring her home despite the dangers. As Lyra spoke, Jake noticed that Queen Zara's expression gradually changed from suspicion to surprise to something that might have been respect. When the story was finished, the Queen returned to studying Jake with those piercing golden eyes. "You could have left her," she said finally. "You could have taken one of our ships and returned to human space. Instead, you chose to help someone from a species that your people consider enemies." "I don't see enemies when I look at your daughter," Jake replied. "I see a brave young person who deserved to go home to her family." Another massive explosion shook the palace, this one much closer than the others. The dust fell from the ceiling, and several of the crystal displays flickered. A military officer approached the throne with urgent news. "Your Majesty, the outer defenses have fallen. General Crix's forces will reach the palace within the hour. We must evacuate you to the emergency bunkers." Queen Zara looked at the tactical displays floating around her throne. The rebel forces had surrounded the palace complex, and their superior numbers were overwhelming the loyalist defenders. The situation was hopeless. "No," she said firmly. "I will not hide in bunkers while my people fight and die. We make our stand here, in this room where my ancestors ruled for 1,000 years." Jake stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if I may make a suggestion?" Every eye in the room turned to him, and Jake felt the weight of their attention. He was about to offer tactical advice to beings who had been fighting wars when humanity was still living in caves. "I've seen urban warfare before," he continued. "Crix is making a mistake by concentrating all his forces on the palace. His flanks are exposed. If you have any reserve forces left, a coordinated counterattack could break his lines. The Valerian. Military commanders looked skeptical, but Queen Zara gestured for Jake to continue. More importantly, Crix needs you alive to legitimize his rule. He won't risk destroying the palace completely. That gives us an advantage we can exploit. Queen Zara considered his words, then turned to her commanders. What reserves do we have? 3 companies of the Royal Guard, hiding in the crystal caves beneath the city, one of the officers replied. But they're outnumbered 10-1. Numbers aren't everything, Jake said. Surprise and determination can overcome superior forces. I've seen it happen. Queen Zara made her decision. We will try the humans' plan. Contact the reserves and coordinate a simultaneous attack from 3 directions. As the commanders hurried away to implement the new strategy, Queen Zara approached Jake again. This time, her expression was thoughtful rather than suspicious. Why are you helping us? She asked. Your people gain nothing from involving themselves in our civil war. Jake looked at Lyra, who was watching the exchange with hope in her eyes. Because some things are more important than politics or species loyalty. Your daughter showed me that courage and compassion can bridge any gap between peoples. Queen Zara followed his gaze to her daughter, then back to Jake. My child has chosen her shield brother well. She stepped back and addressed the entire room. Hear me, all who serve the Valerian Empire. This human has proven himself worthy of our trust and respect. He is Jake Morrison, shield brother to Princess Lyra, and he is under the protection of the royal family. The assembled nobles and officers bowed deeply, accepting their queen's declaration. Jake felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, as if something fundamental had changed inside him. Now, Queen Zara continued, let us show General Crix what happens when someone threatens our family. The battle for the palace began in earnest, but Jake knew they had already won something more important than any military victory. They had proven that understanding and respect could exist between species, and that individual acts of courage could change the course of history. As the sounds of battle echoed through the throne room, Jake stood beside his new family and prepared to fight for a world that was no longer alien to him.